The world is a hot mess. The best way for us as the United States of America to help solve this hot mess that we have all over the globe is to set a good example. And we haven't set a good example with regime change wars, not one, but two, three, four, with fairly disastrous effects. When we talk about Hong Kong, or we talk about Taiwan, or we talk about Catalonia, or anywhere, we talk about California, where there's been talk about they may want to secede, after Trump was elected. Yeah, I'd hate to see California go, but would we really stop them? Would we really use force and put people in jail? And of course, they are putting people in jail in Catalonia. And what is it? 9 people, I think, have been convicted and sentenced to between 9 and 13 years in prison. And of course, the president, I think his president, could have been the prime minister or whatever, but for that area, is hiding in Belgium now, and not hiding, but they're not extraditing him, but they'd like to put him in prison. And you just can't have a government that if somebody decides they want to hold a referendum, you say that's illegal and you're going to put them in prison. What kind of government does that? What kind of government imprisons people because they held a referendum that they said they shouldn't have held? I mean, you can strike down the referendum, if somehow they did something terrible in setting it up. This is, not only is it not right from a legal standpoint, from what the investigation I've done into the politics there and the law there, but it's just stupid. It's just stupid. Life is short. Why would you put people in jail for holding a referendum that you can strike down and say it doesn't count because they didn't do it according to this rule and that rule? And why would we want to waste any of our time forcing someone? It's like forcing your neighbor to come to your cookout. No, you can't do that. And this is insane. And of course, it shows that it's not just totalitarians in China who have some claim territorially to, Hong Kong should be ours. They don't have as much of a territorial claim to Taiwan, of course. But regardless of any of these territorial claims, we have a claim to California. They can't secede. But if the people of California really wanted to secede from the United States of America, would we physically stop them? Would we kill them so that they couldn't leave? I don't think so. And that's what's happening around the world, and not just the totalitarians in China, and not just in places that are not as developed governmentally. It's in Spain, an EU country that basically thinks the solution is to imprison people for a decade or more. And no wonder they're in the streets there. And the funny thing about it is, there are people in the streets in Catalonia, in Barcelona, who are not for independence. They're not for breaking away from Spain. That's always been kind of a very close 50-50. It won big in the referendum, but there was not a tremendous turnout. This is 2 years ago, this referendum that they held, which of course they're now in prison for. It won big, but it was a low turnout. A lot of the people who were on the other side probably didn't show up for the election. But let's hold a vote. Let's hold a vote, and then it's decided. And people could argue, well, should it be a supermajority? You look at 51% of the people want a different form of government. The same form of government cannot hold. And here, of course, they're not talking about some crazy different form of government. They're saying we want to do our own thing, and this is something that we talk about the NBA and China and so on, and well, they look at things a little bit different. There's no cultural differences really here. This isn't about the West versus the East. This is universal, that people ought to have self-determination, and it's just as simple as can be. And of course, governments are not very good about it, because the second any part of what they control decides, hey, we'd like to do it a different way, fella, no, they can't abide that. And so we're not going to get the United States or the United Nations or others to be very good most times without a tremendous amount of public pressure. We have to figure out as a public, and this is a continual theme here, undercurrent, as individuals, we've got to develop the international clout to be able to help our neighbors, whether they be in Asia or in Europe or in America, to be able to determine their own form of government and to go their own way, and to leave countries that they don't feel like they should be a part of.
You wrote about the Catalonia situation several times. I see, at least back in 2017, twice at least, if not three times. And there your message was self-determination. Take it as far as you like.
Yes, and really there's one secession that I think you have to oppose, and that's the southern states leaving so that they could protect slavery in the southern states in the United States. And we fought a civil war over it. What was it? 600, 800,000 people died. And you'd hope that we could have ended slavery another way. Because if there's any other reason that part of this country, if New Hampshire wants to leave, if a couple counties in Wyoming decide they want to secede, I mean, they're going to be kind of landlocked in a big country, but of course that's their rights. And I don't think there's any question among the public at large, any serious question that, of course, if the Catalonians don't want to be part of Spain, are we going to imprison them and force them to be part of Spain? If Hong Kong people don't like the idea of not having any freedoms, is it really okay for China to say, well, that's tough, we're going to stomp on you and force you to live in a totalitarian society? It's look at what's happening in Syria. We're concerned because the Kurds could be completely wiped out by Turkey, which is a much bigger power, and the Turks hate the Kurds, or at least the Turkish government has a long-standing policy, and there's a rift there. And again, I'm not saying, and as I pointed out in Friday's commentary, my argument isn't that the Marines need to, paratroop into Madrid or into Kowloon, the part of Hong Kong that I happen to stay in, and somehow protect these people. I don't think we really can do that. And the truth is, we can't do that in Syria either. Not unless we want to keep troops there forever. That becomes, that's where we are in Afghanistan. The second we leave, any gains, and I say that in air quotes, are just vanish almost immediately. The same's true in Iraq. The mistake that at least Republicans say Obama made was to pull troops out of Iraq, meaning you can't ever pull troops out of Iraq. And here we are, we're talking about pulling 28 soldiers out of northern Syria, but somehow it gave a green light to Turkey to then invade. Well, Turkey's, the moment we're not there standing in the way, they're likely to do what they want to do. They have the power to do it. And you know, you look at what, you know, why are all these things bubbling up in the Middle East? Well, they're bubbling up because we decided to knock out Saddam Hussein. And you know, he wasn't a nice guy, he wasn't a good guy, but it doesn't seem like we had, you know, plan B very well developed. And it has created nightmares in the Middle East, including ISIS. I mean, ISIS is a creation of us creating an Iraqi state that's controlled by Shiites that Sunnis don't like. And the Sunni area is the area that ISIS was able to take over. And of course, I think one of the most ridiculous things, you know, the most ridiculous thing was invading Iraq. It just was a ridiculous thing to do. And again, I know that today, whenever the intelligence agencies tell us anything, we're supposed to believe it. We're somehow un-American if we don't believe it. But boy, were they wrong about Iraq. And boy, have we gotten involved in a lot of wars and a lot of conflicts with bad info, bad intel. And anyway, so that, you know, that the invasion of Iraq set off all kinds of real problems and created an opening for bad things to happen. One of them was ISIS, but the interesting thing to me is how ridiculous I think it is for the US to have engaged ISIS in the way we have. ISIS is not a unique problem. They're, you know, they can have terrorism in Europe, in the United States. We have to watch out for that. But it should have been handled. I think of the old LBJ line, even though he ignored his own line, that American boys ought not to do what Asian boys should do for themselves in Vietnam. And you know, the same's true in the Middle East. Turkey could have gotten a force together to do something about ISIS. Saudi Arabia could have done some. The Sunni countries could have said, we don't want a Sunni government in this part of Iraq and Syria that is run by people as crazy as ISIS. And they could have gone in and done something about it. There was no reason for the United States to go in and do something about it. In fact, by doing so, by so engaging them, we allowed this pipsqueak ISIS, which of course was wiped out as soon as you know, more force was brought to bear, but we in essence elevated them to the world stage and made ISIS a major Islamic jihadist group. And it's silly. And of course, you know, I think the impetus is there's always got to be a demon out there, a devil for us to fight. Sure keeps the money flowing and all kinds of things result. But it's just what we have done in Syria, in Iraq, helping the NATO regime change war in Libya, which has just been a disaster, and Libya is a disaster. And of course, all these migrants dying in the Mediterranean or going to Europe, trying to escape. Look, the whole Middle East is a mess because there's no freedom anywhere. And so, you know, we fund governments like Egypt, we help Saudi Arabia. These are totally unfree countries. We are supporting the tyranny in those countries. We're setting an example that's not very good, that we as a superpower can go in and knock out any government we want, that it's okay for us to support dictators and tyrants and thugs. And so our government in doing that doesn't have a much of a moral voice, not what it should. And you know, I think we get to this point where we have to keep doing all these things, but it's obvious that they aren't working. And when things don't work, you have to do something different. And I don't really, I wouldn't have, if I were president, um, my demeanor would not be the same as Donald Trump's. Uh, and I think my behavior on a day-to-day basis would not be the same as Donald Trump. But I think the idea of pulling out of Syria makes a ton of sense, and I think we ought to pull out of Iraq. And I think anytime we pull out of any of these places, chaos will ensue. That will be the charge. Well, you've got two choices. Either three choices. You can develop a magic anti-chaos machine, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. Or you can leave and bring the troops actually home, not just somewhere else in the Middle East, or you can stay there forever. And that our policy right now is to occupy Afghanistan and Iraq, and if Trump hadn't pulled them out, Syria too, forever. That just isn't the United States as an occupying force. If there are societies like Afghanistan that after 18 years, 17 years, we haven't made enough difference. I mean, how many years are we going to be there? And it was pointed out not too many years ago, a couple of years ago, by one of the generals, that it's probably likely, I think it was Mattis, but it's probably likely that it'd be like Korea, in meaning that we have a force there for 50, 60, 70 years, 80 years, maybe 100 years. And of course, the difference between Korea and Afghanistan is that Korean soldiers aren't grabbing the guns that we provide and shooting us with them. It's a totally different situation in Korea and in Europe and in Japan, where I would argue we should, we're decades away from World War II. I think we can change some of the things we're doing and lower our footprint, save money, and not have problems in doing so. But those are different, totally different situations than what we have in Afghanistan and Iraq, and what, of course, we would have in Syria.
You were talking about secession and letting people go, but one thing the American government has been doing, let's see, in the Middle East, has been to insist on old nation states. Iraq, for instance, it wasn't partitioned. The Kurdistan region is very different from the Sunni region, which is very different from the Shia region. And that could have been three separate countries with, run by people who were pretty much understood what they were trying to do. But for some reason, the United States diplomats and military leaders didn't want to do that. I never understood it, by the way. I don't know if you understand why they didn't.
Well, I think they like the idea of nations. And they're easier. I mean, I think that's why the British drew the lines and said, hey, this area that we just drew is Iraq, because they wanted to be able to deal with the government of Iraq. And they didn't want to have to deal with a bunch of different governments. And of course, the idea of somehow splitting Iraq would be to cut against the whole fiction that everybody had kind of stood up and saluted. And so, yeah, it doesn't make sense. It would have made sense to have some sort of Kurdish country there. But of course, Turkey would have gone crazy, like they're going crazy now, in the sense of they don't want an independent Kurdish nation on their border. And the truth is, Iran doesn't want a Kurdish nation on their border.
Or within their border, because Kurdistan, the Kurdish people, are in all three regions: Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. And that's an interesting problem for everybody.
And a lot of these problems are, they seem like they should be solvable to, and of course they can be, but they seem like it shouldn't be that difficult to get people to realize, hey, we have to all live together. Well, a lot of these conflicts, and not just in the Middle East, all over the world, have been going on. There's a backstory, there's a history, and I don't think it's our job to go around and solve them all, because if we can and they all agree, wonderful. That's not how it's working out. we're deciding that we're going to go with the pretense of this nation against this nation when, like we've just pointed out in the Middle East, that's not how they even stack up. For instance, we hear nothing but that Iran is the worst country in the world. Well, what were they thinking in terms of knocking out Saddam Hussein and then having a government in Iraq that is right in step with Iran? I mean, it's very pro-Iran. We, in essence, gave, after spending money and giving chemical weapons advice to the Iraqis on how to gas the Iranians during that war, and which was just a vicious, terrible war. We were on the Iraqi side, and then we decided years later we're going to basically turn Iraq into a client state of Iran. And just from, if you play all the geopolitical games, you realize we're not playing very well. We're not very smart or something. I mean, what is behind the idea that you invade Iraq? And it just strikes me on so many levels. It's the stupidest political military move that I think the country has ever made. And it is the horrible dividends it's paying. They just keep coming. And we see when anyone makes a move. I mean, the truth is, Trump said months ago, let's pull out of Syria. It's time to leave. And it was almost like the military said no. Like the government said no. He's the commander in chief. He can make that decision. But it's not been easy to make, and the repercussions are huge. This whole area of foreign policy, we have gotten, I think, as a country to where we don't even really pay much attention to it. And it's understandable on one level because we don't have much say so. It's understandable on another level because so much of it is top secret and we can't know. But on another level, it is so obviously ignorant and counterproductive that, I mean, when you think about that, our policy in Afghanistan, we went into Afghanistan to knock out the Taliban because they are kind of a lunatic, jihadist, pro-jihadist government that gave sanctuary and help to Al Qaeda in attacking us on 9/11. We now have been there almost 2 full decades. The Taliban still controls large parts of the country, and our plan for success that would allow us to leave is to strike a deal with the Taliban, who refuses to negotiate with the government there, but will negotiate with us, to strike a deal for them to join the government and be part of the government. Now, how does any reasonable person think that works out? It works out with the Taliban taking over the second we leave. The second we leave. And I mean the second we leave if we left today, the second we leave if we leave in 10 years, the second we leave if we leave in 30 years, the second we leave if we leave in 50 years. It's, and this is not rocket science. I mean, I'm not, this is something anybody should know, and yet we have experts and generals and foreign policy specialists and all of official Washington chasing and spending billions on a policy that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. None of them would stand up and say, yes, this will achieve an Afghanistan that we will be proud of, that will be safe and secure and free and wonderful, and we'll come home. That's not even in the cards. The policy steps are to get the Taliban to become part of the government. We defeated them, and now we want them back. And that's the U.S. policy. That's what we're doing in Afghanistan. And I mean, we could go into some of the others, but that's not unique. That's kind of our policy in Iran and in Iraq. We can never leave. We can never leave without that policy failing the moment we leave.
Are they doing it only for the money? I believe it's a distraction. I believe that the people who run the government, the state, that's trying to get Donald Trump out and has been since the moment he was elected, I believe, or no, maybe I don't believe, I suspect that this is all a distraction so we don't think about what they're doing to control everything.
Well, distractions are done, but I think it's sadly possible that everyone kicks the can down the road. If you hire me to do something that's completely absurd, well, I might be looking for another job. But if you double my salary and then give me a bunch more benefits and then maybe double my salary again, it just seems less absurd somehow for me to keep my job doing. You know what I mean? It's we all talk about certain things in Washington. When they're talking about fixing problems, they're almost always talking about fixing the PR surrounding the problem. In other words, convincing people that it's not a problem, not actually solving the problem. And that's an absurd way to live. But that so much of our political discourse, that's what it's all about. And it's not so absurd for the people who make it go and make it happen.
Right.
Because I just wrote that press release. And okay, it may not be true. And the underlying facts that it's misrepresenting aren't even true. They're something else altogether. But I cash my check. I'm still the PR flack for Congressman Smith. And Congressman Smith just got reelected. And you know what? He may run for Senate and he may win. So am I wrong? Does this not work? It's kind of like when you see absurdity, I think of the Soviet Union. And you kind of knew at some point a society where, everything's run, by kind of commissars and, by a command economy just doesn't make any sense. But is it going to fail today, tomorrow, in 70 years, in 100 years? And if you're a Russian and or a Soviet at that time and the system's completely absurd, does it make sense to say this system's completely absurd? It's BS. I'm not having anything to do with it and go to the gulag? Or does it make sense to salute? One of the funniest stories about the old Soviet Union was that they instituted a bell system for Stalin's speeches, because he would come to speak to the Communist Party folks and they would get up and clap and give him a standing ovation, and they couldn't get them to stop because at least the thought was, the first person who stopped clapping, someone might see and report them and they might be killed along with their family. And so there was, I guess, a time where he just didn't get to speak because after, an hour of everybody clapping until their hands fall off, it was like, I'm tired now. I'm leaving. So they introduced this thing where they would ring bells and then you had to stop. And if you didn't stop, then you were taken out and shot. But that's the societies like that. I mean, the truth is that clapping made rational sense. In a society in which if you stop clapping too early, you might be killed, it makes sense to clap well past other people clapping. And so it's the same sort of thing, I think. I used to think, for instance, on Social Security, that surely before we get to hitting the wall, and just, someone having to say, hey, we just can't continue this program because we're so far broke and the money isn't coming in, and that they'll fix it and they'll do some things that will make it more sustainable. In some ways, which was done during Reagan's time as president, but didn't make it sustainable in a real way. It made it sustainable for a few more years. But anyway, I figured they would do something. And as I've gotten older, I think I don't see how anybody gets a personal political benefit from fixing the problem. And if that's true, if no one can figure out how they benefit, as opposed to, okay, I'll now fall on my sword, I'll now be like totally unpopular because I'm pushing to recognize that we have to cut back on some of the benefits or we have to raise taxes. If nobody benefits from that, it's not going to happen. You're just not going to find enough politicians, especially, who are going to be willing to fall on their sword to do something that makes fiscal sense. And so, now I think, no, we're going to one day wake up and there's going to be a heap of trouble, as they say. And unless I see that more and more, where sometimes I think it's just you're getting old and crotchety, but that there isn't the incentive for people to do the right thing, and incentives are what move the world. If there's an incentive for people to do the right thing, they do the right thing. There's no incentive to do the right thing, but incentives to do the wrong thing. Even good people are going to be doing the wrong thing.
That's certainly true. But it is worth mentioning that some governments don't do the bad thing, right? Denmark, for instance, had a social security system that was very much like ours. It was catastrophically in the wrong direction, and they're moving away from it. People like Bernie Sanders don't know this, but it is becoming less and less like American and less socialistic and more private enterprise. Private individuals are taking on their retirements more in Denmark, of all places. So it can be done.
It can, and you think about the fall of the Soviet Union, and people pouring into the streets in Czechoslovakia, and I think about what Lech Walesa did in Poland. I mean, what motivates someone to take the personal risks that he took? Being arrested on a regular basis and always having the threat over your head. And you see some of these people, from bloggers in Egypt to China and other places, who risk their lives to just speak freely. So people will do the right thing. And people will take tremendous risks, but not politicians so much. And at least that's been my experience, is that, the truth is they trade on, they get where they're going by recognizing where you get credit and where you don't get credit. And like all of us in a sense. And our system is not in a good place. And the truth is, the only way to get it in a better place is for the public to push it there. I think on all kinds of issues, we have a tendency to kind of give credit to, oh, this politician, it was his bill or whatever. But a lot of what's happening, especially on the good side, is being pushed by people who believe in something. And so, of course, we can fix these things. But I think we have to, because, in other words, the Social Security thing, or finding a way to influence major powers through consumer power around the world as opposed to government power. We have to do these things. I don't think the incentives are there in the way that we would want them to be, to expect governments to do them, or to expect the NBA to turn down billions of dollars to fight for freedom. But we can put the NBA at risk so that they see the value in fighting for freedom, because they won't make the billions in China if they're kicked out of their home coliseums in the United States because no one comes to the games anymore, or because there's a rival league, or what have you. And so the point here really is just, it's scary when you don't see the folks who have their hands on the levers of political power with the right incentive structure to do the right things for us. But we can write that, and it ain't easy. I know that. and anybody listening, I think, probably does too. But we can. The point is, we have to, because our politicians are not going to do it for us.
The barrel that we're over, if that's the right metaphor, is that if we pull out, or if we don't do something, something bad's going to happen, and therefore the bad thing is our fault for having pulled out or not done something.
Right.
But if we go in and do something and something bad happens, it's not our fault. That's the thing that really interests me, is that somehow people believe that.
We were trying to help, even though, of course, the most disastrous thing that has been done was to invade Iraq in the first place. And what would be second? Well, second, I don't know, should we pick, arming a bunch of people in Syria, some of whom turned out to be Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on? Or do we say it's creating this huge refugee problem in Europe because we decided, leading from behind, to work with NATO to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya? So it's like we've made all these errors of intervening when we had no business intervening, not just intervening in stupid ways. Some of these things, there's no smart way to we didn't have some government in Libya waiting in the wings, and that's not what we're supposed to do, is regime change and the Americans or the Europeans have a new government waiting for you. But of course the media doesn't cover it that way, and people don't talk about it that way. We recognize that Iraq was a huge mistake, but we somehow don't seem to lay that mistake on intervention. We lay that mistake on, well, that was just the wrong intervention or something. And the idea of not intervening, for instance, we're going to give Russia, we're just handing the Middle East to Russia. Well, let's just step back for a second. What part of the Middle East does Russia control today, after we pulled out of northern Syria, that they didn't control yesterday? And it's none. I mean, they were already in Syria. They've already, like people talk about, well, they want a warm water port in Syria. Well, they've got it. They're in already with the Syrian government. They've had that. And I'm not sure that they want to intervene in the Middle East in the way that we have in recent years, because I don't think it's been very successful for us.